Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm excited to welcome an entirely virtual panel now, hosted by California Council of Science and Technology, CCST, and be moderated by Brie Lindsey, and she will do the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome. I'm so glad you could be here today for our panel on how we can better engage communities in our scientific research. My name is Brie Lindsey. I am the Director of Science Services at the California Council on Science and Technology in Sacramento. And before we begin our discussion, I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm presenting to you from the tribal land of the Nisenan people in Sacramento, which has been a gathering place for many local tribes. So I'd also like to acknowledge the Southern Maidu people to the north, the Valley and Plains Miwok peoples to the south of the American River, and the Patwin Wintun peoples to the west of the Sacramento River. Today, I'll introduce CCST, our Disaster Resilience Initiative, and then I'll dig in with our panelists and answer your questions. Those in attendance, I think, can ask questions in the room, and people on Zoom, please put your questions in the Zoom chat, and they will be read out for you. So CCST, the California Council on Science and Technology, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that provides science and technology advice directly to policymakers. To do so, we tap into the wealth of expertise at California's outstanding academic institutions, including UC Berkeley and UCSF, and cutting-edge federal laboratories through formal partnerships. California is so lucky to have such an incredible network of experts. And a big part of my role as Director of Science Services is to help amplify this expertise in this network and to make it accessible so we can provide relevant and actionable advice for policymakers. Our team does this in a variety of ways, including regular expert briefings to our Capitol audience, policy workshops, in-depth peer-reviewed reports, and our CCST Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program, where we place 15 Ph.D. level scientists, engineers, and social scientists directly into legislative offices and committees, state agencies, and offices of the governor every year for a career-defining experience of government service and leadership training. Several of our alumni were actually part of the workshops earlier today, so I hope some of you were able to participate and get to know them a little bit better. As I don't really need to tell you, the past few years have seen major disaster-related challenges for California, including the effects of climate change, wildfire, extreme heat, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which are all radically disrupting the ways in which we live and work. And in the face of these challenges, we implemented a disaster resilience initiative at CCST, focusing our work to help California better prepare for and respond to these ongoing and intersecting disasters that have compounding effects on our public health, our economy, and our environment. These disruptions are often devastating, but they can provide us with opportunities to redesign our systems to be more resilient, equitable, and sustainable. So through our Disaster Resilience Initiative, we want to bring the best minds in California and beyond to deliver the science and technology advice needed to move toward a resilient California to ultimately improve the lives of all Californians. So that brings us here today, where we will be focusing on how scientists can bring the perspective of communities into their important research. We're joined by two such scholars who both think a lot about the communities their research is meant to serve, and we will be talking about how that's actually done. So I'd love to start by just giving a very brief introduction to both and then asking each in turn to talk a little bit about their research. I'll start with Dr. Megan Jennings, who is a conservation ecologist and co-director of San Diego State University's Institute for Ecological Monitoring and Management. Her research is focused on applied conservation, and in particular, incorporating landscape dynamics like wildfire and climate change into wildlife conservation and connectivity planning. We're also joined by Dr. Michael Mendez, who is an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning at the University of California, Irvine, and visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He has more than a decade of senior level experience in the public and private sectors, where he consulted and actively engaged in the policymaking process. Thank you both for joining.
Glad to be here.
Why don't we start, Megan, by asking about your research. Can you just give us a really high level overview of your research.
Sure. Well, the part that wasn't in my bio is that I actually started out my career in land management, was a civil servant working on managing lands. And so I was often the person who needed science and was wanting to engage with scientists to help co-produce or at least direct the science so that I could have what I needed to help do my job. And so now that I am in the role of being the scientist, I feel a really strong connection to doing that in a collaborative and focusing on co-production in the way that we do that, so that we can better deliver the science to people in the way that they need, meeting them where they are and providing science in service of decision making. So with conservation biology, we focus a lot on this interaction, but I was really focused on the natural resource and land management communities, conservation planning communities. And in some of my work, I was finding that we were sort of preaching to the choir, and there was a need to go beyond, especially when we're talking about climate change, because climate change doesn't recognize fence lines, jurisdictional boundaries, planning sectors. And so to break out of those silos, we decided that we wanted to undertake this project. Will be mostly what I'll refer to today as a project that we just completed for the California Strategic Growth Council. Had a really strong emphasis on meaningful engagement, thanks to their commitment to promoting that and supporting it. And the idea there was to think about how we plan for our natural landscapes and connect that with how we plan for our communities. And what I really wanted to do was to start working with people who weren't the usual people that we worked with, might not value conservation for conservation's sake, but could get there through a different valuation system. So better working with them, understanding what they needed and understanding their value system, so we could find areas of common ground to make better progress and do more together and go farther together.
That was a great overview. Thank you so much. And Michael, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit more about your research?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Brie, for that kind introduction. And thank you to CCST for the amazing work that you do on this science policy interface, particularly with the state legislature, the governor's office, state agencies, and other important stakeholders. And I participated in several panels, and I continue to want to participate because of that important work and the work that you're doing at that science policy politics interface. As you mentioned earlier, I'm an assistant professor of environmental planning and policy at the University of California, Irvine. Previously, I spent 3 years at the Yale School of Environment as a faculty fellow and associate research scientist. My research broadly looks at the intersection of climate change, public health, and environmental justice. My first round of research in my research agenda really looked at how social movements, in particular environmental justice groups, low-income communities of color, were engaging around these issues around science, environmental problems that had strong technical and scientific backgrounds to have a stronger emphasis on equity and racial justice. And now my new research looks at how do we safeguard and adapt socially vulnerable communities, those communities first and hardest hit by our changing climate, climate-induced disasters, if you will, such as wildfires, heat waves, droughts, extreme weather events. So in California, we don't lack any of those. And particularly, what we do lack is a scientific understanding and background, and specifically governance and policy to help safeguard these communities. So increasingly, my research is really about translating scientific evidence, which includes quantitative and ethnographic. We really need to understand how do these scientific data really means on the ground. And I work with, similar to your organization, with various stakeholders from community groups, politicians, regulators, to help improve environmental problems that have strong racial and environmental justice implications. So really happy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for that overview. And you've started to answer my next question, which is, and I'll kick it back to you just in case you didn't tie it up the way you might. Just asking, who do you consider to be in your research community in your most recent efforts?
Sure. I consider myself to be a strong interdisciplinary scholar first and foremost. I'm a trained urban and environmental planner, but oftentimes I get mistaken for a geographer, a public health scholar, sometimes an anthropologist, sociologists, environmental sociologists, increasingly sometimes environmental science. So from an academic scholarship perspective, those are sort of the communities that I integrate with, particularly around environmental and public health issues. But in terms of the public facing work that I do, translating the research to have science in action, if you will, it's from governments, policymakers, again, regulators, and most importantly, community groups, NGOs that are on the front lines, living and working in some of these hazardous conditions, either if it's pollution that they experience on their daily lives from water and air and soil, to, again, these climate induced decisions. So increasingly, I work and co-author, and we'll talk about this later, with some of the community groups that are on the front lines to ensure that that the scientific research is grounded in the real embodied experiences of these communities.
Yeah, the interdisciplinary nature of the work that you do is so clear, and it seems, just a sign of the times that these are the kinds of collaborations that need to be happening. Megan, how about you? Who do you consider to be part of your research community?
Yeah, well, like Michael, I feel like I work in a really interdisciplinary and even transdisciplinary world in especially as I work more on climate adaptation work, and I move a little bit away from a strict focus on sort of wildlife conservation, because again, I think we get more done thinking about it in terms that work, for everyone can see themselves in it. But, we work across campus with folks in geography, in urban planning. Michael and I were just comparing notes on who we know in common before the panel. Environmental engineers, biologists, folks like that. But in terms of the communities, the external communities that I work with, as I mentioned to start, really, my people where I started are natural resource specialists, land managers, other biologists, advocacy organizations interested in advancing conservation planning. But I think being in San Diego, where I'm located, I'm on the homelands of the Kumeyaay people. I am fortunate to be the beneficiary of a long history of sort of collaborative and cross-disciplinary conservation planning that has involved local jurisdictions and really connected with the way that we do city planning and community planning at a broader level to sort of think more proactively about how we do those things. And so more recently, some of the people that I personally have been more actively engaged with are people in city planning, local jurisdictional planning, and regional planning, moving beyond the folks who work on sort of open space and natural resource planning and connecting more with those who are working in land use planning and climate adaptation planning, because there's all these connections that are available to be made, but we tend to still do a lot of siloed planning in these different efforts. And so trying to work together where we can bridge those divides and work together more. And I just wanted to add, one of the reasons and one of the ways in which I do that is by working really closely with a boundary spanning organization, the Climate Science Alliance. And they have partners, I think it's over 400 at this point, across all these different sectors, local, state, federal, tribal governments, a lot of tribal organizations. We work really closely with a lot of tribes, and I'd be excited to talk more about that as we move on, and having those folks help drive our research agenda. And then, folks in the business world, consultants, and some of those folks, as well as nonprofits. So it's a really, it's a broad network, and it's really exciting to have that opportunity to have that connection.
Yeah, I think that's beyond a broad network. That's very inclusive. And so that makes me wonder, how did you decide who to pull into your research, and at what level and at what point? I'll send that back to Megan. We'll just go ping pong, I think.
Yeah, sure. So most recently, part of it was who are we already working with, which was a lot of folks. And then, we tried to do some snowball sampling, like who do you know that who should be here? Who should we be talking to, and asking for word of mouth? But, we've also done some things to try and identify who are the most willing actors. How do we build a community of practice by helping people start to do more and integrate more, and then having peers learn from one another, looking from, say if we're trying to help jurisdictional planners think about how to bring the natural landscapes into their planning. If we get sort of momentum going in one jurisdiction, how can they help their neighbors see and provide examples, things like providing case studies or just providing the opportunity, fostering partnerships and conversations so they can learn from one another. So part of it is, really looking for people who are ready to take those steps and start taking action. I think we've also, in particular, for growing, for me, the newest thing has been really growing this network in jurisdictional planning connections. And we've really relied heavily on our metropolitan planning organizations, SANDAG and SCAG down here. So the San Diego Association of Governments and the Southern California Association of Governments, because they have such a network down to some of the other local jurisdictions. And their role is to help provide some of that information. So how, by partnering with them, can we help reach more people? So that's just sort of one of the ways we've started to do that and try to continue growing to make sure that we bring everybody to the table who wants to and should be engaged.
And how about you, Michael? How does your answer compare?
Sure, and I just really happy to hear Megan talk about the sort of the transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary focus that she's doing, particularly with urban and public policy type of planners. We started our pre-call talking about some of the planners that I know down in San Diego State, and that she's actually working with them. So it's really a great work to see the biological sciences teaming up with the policy sciences around these important issues. Before I go into about the stakeholders, how I build those relationships, I also want to mention a stakeholder that we haven't mentioned and how they're quite important for carrying forward our research agenda is the news media and journalists themselves. They're quite important, in particularly some of these emerging scientific and environmental problems, to ensure that we're able to, as scholars, no matter what kind of discipline, we're not trained to tell stories. We're not trained to have that narrative focus and distill our research findings to a more general audience, let alone how do you pitch a story and how do you say your 3 points in terms of science communications to get your point across. And increasingly, particularly around these equity issues, that is something that I had to really work closely and train myself, talk to other senior scholars or other people that are work as thought leaders or policy think tanks on how to do that. And that's been quite important in terms of getting some of these important issues, particularly around environmental justice, get it in print and media online. For most importantly, for policymakers can actually see it, understand it, and start seeing the salience, what they call in the policy science, the salience of an issue, where it can be part of their agenda setting, meaning being on their list of policy priorities that either they're going to push forward in terms of a policy at a regulatory agency or in terms of a law that they propose and hopefully ultimately would get enacted to do some of these changes. So I think that's also something really important, increasingly as scientists, as scholars, engaging on that power of storytelling and distilling our information to be more public facing. In terms of working with communities, one of the biggest thing is just, really going to the community, spending time in that community and trying to get away from a very extractive idea of what research is. It's very different when you're a student, a PhD student, a master's student. You have an object, like a goal in your dissertation, your thesis, you have a committee, and you have to get it done. So we really need to untrain ourselves from that. And as we go into these communities and not just see these communities either as to get publications in sort of our publish or perish academic research paradigm or for grant making. We really have to build partnerships ahead of time. There has to be some form of reciprocity. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but building that trust takes a while. And, as I've gone into these communities, I've spent some time there, and what has happened is sort of that snowball that Megan was talking about. Actually, other environmental justice communities, labor rights organizations starts to see your work, other NGOs start to see your work, and I've been asked several times now to replicate community-based type of projects, thankfully. And I hope as my career moves forward, I'm able to continue that.
Thank you so much for that answer, and especially for bringing up the media and the importance of storytelling. I think in one of Megan's and my pre-call conversations, we were actually talking about the importance of storytelling, and I was listening to a Brene Brown podcast, and she referred to one of her mentors who said, I really wish that I could just bring in some great numbers into a legislator's office and get support, but I can't. Or I wish I could just bring in a great story and get support that way, but I can't. And how important it is to have all of that together, the kind of quantitative and the scientific, technical expertise, and also a story that makes things human. And I would love to hear a little bit, this is a bit of a tangent, but I would love to hear from Megan some of the less traditional routes of transmitting some of the co-produced knowledge that you've had.
Yeah, we have been so fortunate. So my partners at the Climate Science Alliance, they have this whole art and community initiative, and it's really about getting things out to people in a way that connects with people, not just intellectually, but emotionally. Because climate adaptation is an emotional issue. It affects, the place where you live, your family, your home, the things that you experience. So why should it all just be data and charts, which is often, as scientists, it's often the way that we treat things, but it's sort of antiseptic, right? It doesn't get to people in the place where these things are actually affecting them in their real lives. So we had the opportunity through this most recent project, because we were empowered to really grab onto this meaningful engagement. We took that seriously. And so we have this fantastic opportunity to have such talented artists work with our scientific team and say, what are the themes of your research and how can I help you communicate that? So we had an oil-based artist develop some different paintings, and actually one is even a cabinet. I can share, I forgot to share links. I'll share links when I get a chance to share the beautiful artwork, but interpretations of our science, what is refuge? What is refugia? What is the conflict between fragmentation and sort of biounity? How does fire affect us, and interpreting that? And then we also had another really fantastic artist do watercolor interpretations of our data maps, and then talk with our practitioners and our project partners about their stories. Why are they coming to the table? And I just think that connection, it's not that part, it's really what you were talking about, Brie. It's you have the science, you have the data and the technical and the quantitative part, but then you have, it links to our data, but then you have that story, that piece that touches someone and helps them feel connected, especially if data isn't their language, they don't want to nerd out with us on the science. How do they, right? I mean, we love to nerd out, but that's not everybody's bag, and that's okay. So how do we reach them and let them know that this is important and give them a way to connect with it? And I'll just also echo that, the media is another important way, as Michael was saying, and that's something that we really rely on as well, especially for the natural resources. There's 25 million people in Southern California, and not all of them know what is out there in our backcountry, what wonderful biological resources that we have, and the media can help us raise that awareness. And we're actually working with some folks in the media to do that on one of our projects. So I just wanted to echo how important that is for us as well.
Michael, I didn't know if you had anything to add there.
I like to echo Megan's use of linking art and science, which is another form of storytelling, or what they call the environmental humanities. Historically, if we look back at natural resource conservation, the role that people like Aldo Leopold, who's sort of like the godfather of conservationism, how he used poetry and artwork, how famous artists such as Albert Bierstadt and his renderings of Yosemite, how these ideas of nature, of science, of preservation or conservation spread out and kind of created this idea of what is nature, who's included and who's not, and what we value. And fundamentally, we need to understand and acknowledge, many scientists don't want to acknowledge the role of values and worldviews in our scientific practice. And just if you ever read Aldo Leopold's San Almanac, or his essays on what is the one about the mountain and the wolf, that, I use that in class. And then, reading backgrounds about that back, over 100 years ago, people used to cry reading that story. So just really understanding that values and worldviews can influence our research agenda and our scientific practice. As sustainability scientist Donatella Meadows once said, we measure what we value. And so who gets to decide what we value and who gets to decide on what data we use? So again, really acknowledging sort of the implicit bias that we all can bring to our scientific and research practice. Everyone has a positionality. I have a positionality as a male. I may see things differently because of the male privilege in which I live in. So, and then also adding that level of intersectionality, gender, race, sexuality, and class, immigration status. I think we really need to bring in a more diverse set of skill sets in terms of technical, but also in terms of values and worldviews and perspectives and positionality.
Yeah, I thank you. That's such an important point, especially when you're talking about how science interfaces with policy. You cannot divorce a conversation in a policy setting from values. And that idea of having other ways and stories to kind of like sink those numbers into your bones and like really thinking about how you're aligning the values that are inherent in the work because you've chosen to study it exactly as you said, aligning that with the people that you're talking to, because even if a policymaker, for instance, has all of the data, that doesn't make the decision. And that's really hard for scientists sometimes to really wrap their head around. You have the information. Why aren't you deciding exactly this way? Well, because there are a lot of values and priorities.
Competing values and priorities. And then if anyone in this room or online has not seen Don't Look Up, I think that's a classic case of, what's happening in terms of COVID and climate change, being metaphors for that. And it's really important to get away from this idea of a deficit model that we often have in the scientific field of like, these individuals are not listening to us because they're stupid, they're uneducated. We just need to educate them more. But increasing, environmental psychology, focusing around climate change or even COVID shows some of the people that are denying both COVID and climate change are some of the most highly educated individuals. And so if it's not following under that model of the deficit, then what else is it? So it's really this sort of clash around culture, around values and worldviews again. So, and I remember the name of the essay by Leopold. It's Think Like a Mountain. So you have not read that, I highly encourage you. And I think that's a quintessential idea about mixtures of values and conservation science.
Thank you. So that's a great segue too, talking about competing values and conflicting values, especially when you're trying to build a coalition of many stakeholders in designing and understanding and carrying out research. So I'd love, and you also both touched a little bit on trust and how important it is to slowly build these relationships. I'd love to maybe start with Megan on, how have you navigated, first of all, building trust in new relationships and partnerships, and also understanding that people are coming with different values to this work?
Yeah, I think I started out in my brief intro talking about, I came to this because I realized not everyone valued what I valued for the same reasons. And that's totally okay. And we have to be okay with that if we're ever going to make any progress. Otherwise, we're just going to butt heads forever and never make any progress. So, and I think that's part of how I have built trust is by somebody who is trying to listen, trying to solicit input and just actively listening. And I think part of how I started to build trust is by being someone who was a land manager. I've had the good fortune of working where I work for 20 years now. So people have known me in that life as someone who needed to be part of the decision-making process or informing those who are making decisions. And now I'm the person providing the research in service of that. And so they know that I understand what it's like to be on both sides. And in fact, in that job, I often had to provide the information. My job was not to make a decision, but rather provide information and support the best possible decision. And I understood sometimes the thing that I was supposed to be advocating for in my job might not win out. And so I've carried that forward into the work that I do, that I try not to place my values on the things that I'm hearing from others and rather say, what are your values? How are you coming at this? How can we evaluate the different ways, perceptions, and priorities of the people that we're trying to bring together and find common ground, rather than trying to convince somebody of something? And I think we also have the good fortune of being in a time where like multi-benefits is something that we talk about, right? How can we achieve, there's so many opportunities to achieve multiple benefits from the different things we can do, especially in climate adaptation. How can we articulate that in a way where people see that some of their needs are being met? And so I think that combination of things is really how to sort of build trust and help bridge the gaps between different value systems. And I just wanted to, I was excited when Michael started talking about that a minute ago, because I just love to interject this little story of one really big sort of aha moment for myself was I was working on some landscape connectivity planning for a highway focused on, conservation of wildlife. And I came to some of my tribal partners and I said, we've been working on this. What do you guys think about this? Would this help you? Would this help with the part of their reservation? It falls within the area that we were planning on or planning for. And I said, how does this strike you? Is this something the tribe would be interested in? And she said, honestly, Megan, the tribe has a lot of other concerns and sort of fish to fry, and this isn't super high on our priority list. But if we thought about the cultural value that you would get of protecting important cultural landscapes and important ancestral sites that you would accomplish by protecting this for wildlife, now that would be something that would really be valuable to us. So I started thinking about what are the terms in which we could negotiate what the value is for you, where we could say, what's this multiple benefit that we could possibly accomplish together?
Yeah, that's interesting, and a lot of work to listen to so many people and try to find needs that overlap. I would love to hear, Michael, do you have any stories about tensions between different community members or stakeholders that you've worked with, and how you navigated and built trust there?
I think the biggest change in this sort of co-productionist framework that we're talking about, changing that research paradigm away from being extracted to be more co-produced and reciprocity, is I can't say where, but I've been on federal. I've been on state, federal, and local government agencies, as well as philanthropic foundations on major grant review panels. And so there's still a lot of pushback on one of providing a large amount of the research towards community-based organizations. Oftentimes you always hear that they don't have the capacity, they're not going to spend the money right. And so they're giving the funding to the same type of NGOs and other types of organizations that have traditionally always done these type of research, and then that trickles down to the community-based groups, and then maybe 25% of that grant funding actually goes directly to the community-based organization. A second aspect that I have seen tensions a lot with is this idea that a lot of philanthropic as well as agencies across state, local, and federal are trying to have diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics into their grant making process, and trying to steer researchers to do environmental, at least in my realm, obviously, which I'm an expert in, is environmental projects that have that, what they call JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion aspects of research that you're working on issues that are important to marginalized communities, communities that are hardest hit from climate change. So viewing, from philanthropic to government major grants, that's great, and that's a major step forward. And then there's some aspects to provide funding to this community-based organization, but also what's not great is that you see who are the PIs, who is the research team. The research team doesn't look like anyone from the community that they're working in. And, it really chaps me, my hide when I see that. And particularly when they're not opening up their circle, their network of academic scholars. It's always that same group of primarily white male or full professors. So JEDI should also focus in on early career scholars, first generation scholars, and of course, people of color, women of color in particular. So if we look 5 years ago and definitely 10 years ago, there would be a lot of uproar if there was an all male PI team and that we were only funding all male PI teams. And we don't see that in terms of our research practice, and particularly in our grant making process, that is more JEDI should include PIs. And what also, and JEDI should not just be like I'm hiring a postdoc or a student of color. The power dynamics and imbalances are great. And it's very different to be a student on a project than being the actual PI. And so I think that JEDI in terms of our research composition really needs to fundamentally be changed, and that our PI team should also, to some extent, as best we can, be representative of the communities we're studying.
Could I add something on, Brie? Yeah, so I think that's such an important point. And one thing we also talk about in the work that I do, I think as Michael was alluding to at the end there, sometimes there's not a local available PI. I think it's also important when you're involving these different community groups to sort of accomplish equity, inclusion, and diversity is to not have it be performative. There's a lot, because so many calls are out there, for grants and that sort of thing. I think there are people coming to the table asking. It's still extractive in the nature that Michael was referring to, rather than focusing on reciprocity. And one way that we've worked to avoid this and tried to eschew that whole approach is by asking our partners. In particular, we do this with our tribal partners. You hear a lot of people say, oh, they need a seat at the table. No, they need to be guiding. They need to be at the front. They need to be leading. So even if you don't have an available PI, creating your structure such that that community group shapes and determines what is going on, so that they are empowered to have that leadership role, even if they are not in a traditional leadership type position. One thing we also talk about, sort of back to this valuation, is equal valuation of different forms of knowledge. So we are not just stuck in the academic mindset, so that we have an opportunity to bring in other types of knowledge that have immense value, but that typically we don't count the same way for grants and for tenure and promotion, that kind of thing.
And I echo everything Megan is saying, and particularly the last part. It's this type of research, this co-production, this type of research, linking scientific practice and findings to that ethnographic policy aspect takes longer. And moving with the speed of trust. Either you're meeting community members, trusted community members, trusted leaders. That takes time, because they are tired of researchers coming in, helicoptering in, taking multi-million-dollar grants many times, never sharing that research for funding, never compensating groups, community residents for their time. Maybe it's 10 cents on the dollar of what a larger, more established community-based organization would get. So I think what Megan says, yeah, so as we move through the tenure process and how we evaluate merits of research, that really needs to be understood better.
Yeah, that moving at the speed of trust is I'd like to put that on my wall or something. That's such a great phrase. And so important when you are co-producing knowledge. I mean, especially you're talking about communities who are weary from having their knowledge extracted and only pieces used, probably, and not having a holistic view of sometimes very old traditional knowledge, for instance, and not being used properly. And that makes me think there's so many ways to go before we get to audience questions. And I think one of the last questions that I'll ask before we open it up is, we're talking about engagement with communities, and that can mean so many different things. And we're also talking about co-production of knowledge. So I'd love to hear from each of you, at what points are you pulling in these other perspectives? Are they part of the design of your research? Are they part of the translation? There's so much in between. So where does your engagement happen, and where is the co-production of knowledge? And I think I'll ask Megan to start.
Yeah, well, for me, it's not about a project. It's about like a lifetime commitment to these relationships. And I think that's how you build and sustain trust, is by continually being there, not just showing up and saying, oh, I have a grant that I want to apply for, and you check my box. And instead saying, I'm in this with you. How can we move forward? And what do you want? So for me, a lot of the ideation of what do we even want to accomplish is we get there from, and we actually have this whole evolution of projects that have continually built on each other, because during that process of talking about what should a project be, what are our questions, what do we need to answer, what do we need to deliver, how do you need to implement this, how can we sort of manage that whole arc with you and fit everything that you need in there, we continually come up with new research gaps or needs by this whole listening and engagement process. So, I would say one way I often think about it is it shouldn't be in the context of a project. It should be in the context of a long-term commitment to the relationship and to that trust, because that's how, for our tribal partners in particular, we, have built on 4, 5, 6 projects that all come from having these conversations and just continually being with each other, forming friendships. It's not just a business relationship or a research relationship. It's, you have a life outside of this, and how can we help connect this with what you need, both to accomplish what you want for your community, but to be a human person too.
I'm hearing you say it's not just extractive, it's also it's not just not extractive, it's also not transactional. It's
right,
authentic.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Michael.
Sure, great, excellent question, and have similar but different perspectives, because especially coming in as a scholar of color, and sort of being one of the few people of color working in some of these institutions around environmental justice. So our tenure and review process is, at least we have a little bit more precaution when we do some of these community engaged research. So I kind of fell into this community engaged research by accident. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but I also felt bolstered to be able to do this once I had my book out, and then I won awards and I won major research grants. And so I felt a little protected, particularly as a scholar of color, to work on community engaged research, or if you will, scholar activist type of work, because of the very nature of what Megan was talking about earlier, that our merit and review process doesn't value this type of research. But because when I felt like I had a bit of a safe harbor, I felt I could enter into sort of this community engaged or community-based or community-based participatory type of research. So I really came into this issue deciding to research another topic. So a lot of my research now looks at climate-induced disaster, wildfires, heat waves, and drought, in particular wildfire impacts of undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. So I came into this research project doing another research topic. I wanted to do this sort of an intersectional approach to social movements, of how environmental justice groups were coming together with immigration rights organizations to advocate for climate action. And wanted to kind of document how that was manifesting itself in California and a couple other places where you had seen major marches and a joining of these two social movements together. And I started doing that research and talking to groups, and they kept on telling me, you should really talk to, folks from the Mixteco community or Indigena Community Organizing Project, MICOP, and the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, COS. One was a migrant rights group, one was an environmental justice group in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And they're saying they're doing this in practice, not in terms of, protesting and just pushing forward policy. They're dealing with it at a local level because of the extreme wildfire events that hit that area. So I started interviewing folks and some of the key players down there that were living and working through some of these wildfires. And I was just amazed by the work, and I abandoned that sort of very broad kind of research perspective. And then I held a scoping a workshop, scoping analysis workshop, to kind of see what was the lay of the land, what was going on with these wildfires. So I invited, I was at Yale at the time, so I had a much bigger research budget for these type of events. So I brought in everyone to Yale, from the migrant rights, environmental justice groups, to some policymakers, and then of course students, and we kind of scoping that. And then I was just amazed by the work, and in particularly the work that they're doing with undocumented migrants, both Latino and Indigenous, who are not only marginalized groups, they're hyper marginalized when a disaster hits, because as we know, there's existing disparities that these groups have before disaster that are only hyper marginalized when a disaster hits, or exasperated, and highly stigmatized at the same time as well. And I just felt I couldn't tell the story adequately without bringing in these individuals into the research design and data justice approach. So I asked them to be not only contribute to the research, and I asked them to be my co-authors. And then so we come up with that scoping analysis sort of served as that basis for our framework, and then we took that into our research questions, the data that we gathered, and then corresponding policy solutions. And for that Central Coast area, it was really a powerful mechanism for us to highlight, these disparate impacts to undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants, and it just sort of it was held to a higher standard when the media would come to us, or when we spoke to policymakers, because of this co-produced, community engaged research that we were doing policy briefings at the local, state, national, and even international levels at the United Nations, because these wildfires and climate refugees and migrants, from Australia, Brazil, and Greece, other places it's happening. They wanted to learn from us from that. So because of that model, and people were seeing that, these wildfires in California are occurring a lot in Northern California. So migrant rights and labor justice groups approached me to replicate that model. So long story short, that's sort of how I kind of fell into this issue. And I couldn't really do it again because, as an early career scholar, I felt before I wasn't in that position to do some of this research now, but thankfully I'm very grateful that now I am, and trying to, and I know Megan's doing this too, trying to have senior scholars and grant making institutions understand that this work is valuable, it takes longer, and that other early career scholars shouldn't be afraid, like I was initially, to do this type of work.
And I know we want to go to questions from the audience, but I just had to add on that, that whole perspective of like, how do you get yourself to the place where you can do this, because it's not something that traditionally has been valued in academia. While Michael says that he sort of fell into it, I snuck into it. So I shared with Brie, and it may not be apparent from my bio, but I am not tenure track faculty. I am soft money researcher. So the university doesn't much pay attention to what I do as long as I'm bringing in my funding. So as long as I find funding that values this meaningful engagement, again, like that opportunity with the California Strategic Growth Council saying meaningful engagement, and we really mean it. We're not talking broader impacts here. We mean you're on the ground co-producing. These people are part of your research team. You are not, sending out a survey and then, dumping a peer-reviewed paper on them and saying, I did my connection and we're good. That has given me the opportunity to continue expanding. But again, I think some things need to change. I think they are slowly changing. But, for all of you out there who are earlier career scientists, or researchers in some way or another, find your opportunities, whatever they be, and don't hesitate, because it does take a long time to build these relationships. And so the later you start, the more time that you've lost not being able to do this, if this is something that you would like to engage in. And I think everyone should.
Thank you both so much. I want to pause to see if there are any questions in the room space, or maybe that came through from Zoom space.
Hi, thank you all for your amazing responses. Very interesting to hear. I'm actually not a environmental or social science scientist. I deal all day moving small volumes of liquid from one tube into another. So it's a little bit difficult for me to conceptualize, like how I can integrate these affected communities by my research or into like how I live on and communicate my science. I was wondering if both of you could talk a little bit about like specific projects that you feel you've really channeled your values through, and how yeah, and just give us a little bit more detail on like a project that you were really excited by and how you made it work. Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Michael looks like he's hesitating, so maybe that gave me pause to think about it. I guess there are sort of two related projects I would highlight that for me have really sort of embodied my values, and it's the two that I've sort of been alluding to. So one is the one that I spoke directly about, the connecting wildlands and communities, and that one has been so important for me because it has really given, I was already doing sort of community engaged research, but it was with a more narrow community. And now we're talking about transdisciplinary and breaking out of these planning silos. And that has been really transformative for me as a researcher. And I think for the research that we're doing and delivering to the partners that we're working with and co-producing with. And so I think really the opportunity to see how to see the opportunity and to go through the experience of expanding the network and working with a different community, and how can I work with other academics with expertise in those areas, but also, as the PI of that project, it was led from the background and perspective that we had put on our proposal, which came from sort of the conservation and natural resource background. But, how can we build it and expand it? That has been really, I think, sort of educational and transformative, and really embodied the values that I have personally of wanting conservation to be important to more people and helping to find that connection for people in a way that meets them where they are. And then I just wanted to add that for me, the add-on to that has been developing this resilient restoration project that we work on with our tribal communities, where it's about how to work together to help not only those communities, but those outside those communities understand the value of natural resources for tribal communities and their culture. I mean, climate adaptation and what happens in natural landscapes is so inherently tied to the identity and place and community for tribal communities. And I think a lot of folks who focus more on Western planning and the Western way of doing things miss out on that. And so really having them lead and guide us to help provide the Western science that can be merged with the Indigenous science, again, has just really expanded my horizons and given me so much more education about how to continue doing the work that we're doing and doing it better.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great response. I'm very glad that there's people out there doing the research that you do.
Michael?
Thank you. I guess two projects. I have two projects that are quite different that I'm quite proud of, that had either it was directly community engaged or had some a result that really tried to change our paradigm around environmental policy and governance. The first, is about on the wildfire research that I'll talk about momentarily. But the very first one is my book on climate change from the streets, how conflict and collaboration strengthen the environmental justice movement. So this looks at California and California's global influence on climate change, how California has been a global leader around climate change, the passage of Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. And essentially, this became sort of the history book on California's climate change, but from the people of color perspective. So it's important. I'm quite proud of that book because Yale University Press published it, and it was the first. Yale Press is well over 100 years old. They had never published an environmental justice monograph, a book singly dedicated to environmental justice. I was their first book, and not only was I their first book, I was their first U.S. Latino or Latinx scholar that they ever published in their environmental publishing program. So just breaking those type of glass ceilings in terms of scholarship as well as authorship was important. And then also telling that story. We often hear about California being a success story and the books that have been written. There's another book on California's environmental history. It published a couple of years ago by a competing major academic press. It won awards. People of color, I've mentioned twice in that book in passing. So there's this continual erasure of people of color leading on environmental issues and really participating on governance around climate change. And my book really kind of, because I used to work in the legislature, so I had a very insight behind the curtain view of the politics, the conflicts that people of color were encountering in that legislative process, particularly from mainstream or what I call traditional environmental groups, the big greens, and how there were really resistance in the early years of climate change programs and legislation to have an equity and a public health focus and centering frontline communities, those communities first and hardest hit. So the news stories that you would hear were mainly of big green, white environmental groups as well as legislators. And so my book kind of told that story, and it sort of created some kind of conflict of, how great California's story, but as we move forward at the federal level and other places that always look to California, yes, we need to learn from our successes, but we also need to learn from our failures and sort of how we were also resistant in the early years to have that equity and public health focus on climate change. So I'm quite proud of that. And then the other work, of course, is working directly with migrant rights groups who are traditionally not brought into the environmental realm, and how, because they're essentially forced to be disaster experts and climate adaptation experts. Now, helping them to create a space where they can speak for themselves to policymakers, to philanthropic organizations, local, state, national, and even national level. So those are my two projects. I'm very happy, very different in scope and outcomes. So
great, thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting conversation. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into something that Michael, you alluded to earlier. And there's throughout this, there's been a lot of conversation about sort of expanding sort of the production to include marginalized groups and younger career scientists and outside groups, and to expand authorship, expand credit, expand collaboration. But in my experience with both doing some environmental justice work and then also working here actually at Berkeley to expand sort of access for graduate students, postdocs, early career scientists, is that often that work is uncompensated and is expected to be done on top of your existing job. Like, for example, this entire conference, which was planned by people working for free, right? And so how do you kind of work with that and create a system where that work is not being unpaid, uncompensated labor on these people who are the least able to do unpaid, uncompensated labor? And how is that not continuing to sort of be an extractive, unequal relationship between the compensated university researchers and the uncompensated people out in these communities?
sure. I'm sorry, what was your name again?
My name's Sean.
Sean, thank you for that, and thank you for that question. Thank you for the work, and thank you for your co-organizers, and from students to other faculty members and other scientists that are working on this, and the work that you do. And thank you for attending our session. And I think that's an important question, something that I'm grappling with. And I was just talking to a colleague about this, and still as early career scientists, I have to push back all the time, and I know it puts me in a precarious position to push back and advocate for everything that you're talking about in some of these review sessions that we're looking at grants. And it's hard. It's hard. I was brought into maybe last year brought into some grant, an RFP. There was a pot of funding that this one agency wanted to do, and it had to do with greenhouse gas emissions. And I won't say anything much more than that, but it was primarily engineers, and a certain type of engineer. And really having to push back on that community perspective and that compensation that you're talking about. It's hard. The last couple of years where I've been invited in a position to do this because of sort of that, the credentials, thankfully, that I'm bringing up. It's still scary, but I was talking to that colleague. I'm like, if I'm in those positions to review and I don't speak up, who else will? And I think, these are individual choices that we want to make, but that's a choice I've made as a scholar. And it's not always pretty but it really takes people to speak up. And I really applaud the work that women scientists have done. And like I said, 10 years ago, people probably wouldn't blink twice if we had all male scientific teams or issuing grants. But now that conversation is so important of having a diverse research panel in terms of gender. And I'm hoping that increases for other types of diversity as well.
And I'll just add on that we've tried to make an effort to make sure that we go after grant funds that do allow funding our partners. So they are not expected to participate for free. A lot of those people have a capacity problem and can't without compensation. And so it is not fair to ask of their time. Like, we keep talking about this in this diversity, equity, inclusion work, that the people we're asking to do the work are the people who are already taxed and facing these issues. So, we can't keep asking for a whole lot of labor without any sort of compensation. So I try to focus on grant opportunities that have that. And then, as Michael said, advocate for them where possible. For example, a lot of these new state grants that are coming forward about climate adaptation, before they develop an RFP, they have a whole process for you to comment on the standards that will be built into that proposal design. And so, I think that's an opportunity to say we must have opportunity to submit budgets that include costs for partners, participants, the people who need it, boundary spanning organizations, community-based organizations, whatever it is. And some are even, requiring that those people be part of the PI team, and rightfully so.
Thank you so much.
It looks like we have like 2 minutes left. I don't know if there is another question in the audience that we can do like a lightning round answer. And I can't tell from the room. So, okay, run up there. Yay.
Hi, my name's Sneha. I guess for a lightning round, what is one major piece of advice you would give to young early career researchers in different fields as they try to start engaging more with their local communities?
I would say follow your passion. What makes you passionate to research? Again, these relationships take a long time. So part of the reciprocity the process is you have to feel passionate about what you're doing and the communities and issues you're working with. So I think, and don't give up. Keep breaking those glass ceilings. It's hard, but I think it's important.
And I think I mentioned this to Brie when we spoke the other day, and I hold on to this and I use it a lot. Speak once and listen twice. So I was fortunate to participate in this tribal climate adaptation symposium that the Climate Science Alliance hosts every other year. And in the second year of doing it, they brought in some folks who did dancing, shared some of their culture with us, and shared some stories. And one of the stories that they shared was about Trickster, which is a popular character in a lot of Indigenous stories. And anyway, the moral of the story was to speak once and listen twice. And I thought that what a great way to start this whole symposium. And I share that with as many people as I can, because I think that is so critically important, especially for scientists. We get trained that our voices are the most important. We have the science, we're racing in to help save you. And that's crap. We need to listen, because otherwise we're not doing what people actually need, and we're not meeting the need, and we're not helping where the help is needed. So I think that's I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. This was a really great discussion.
Thank you so much, both of you, Megan and Michael, for your brilliant and thoughtful insights that you shared with us today. I feel so lucky to have been able to have this conversation with you today. And I want to say thank you for everybody else who joined us, both in the room and on Zoom. Thank you for sharing your time with us and for your questions about these important topics. There were a number of links that were shared during this talk that I think that the team will be putting onto the Slack. So please check those out. There's a lot of great stuff in there. And if you're interested in learning more about CCST or our fellowship program, please visit our website at ccsT.us, or you can reach out to me directly at brie.lindsey@ccsT.us. I want to thank also the UC Berkeley and UCSF science policy groups for putting on such an impactful symposium and for including this discussion. And I hope all of you enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you again.